So we said in the last video that a firm's markup depends on its elasticity, right? If it's facing very elastic demand, then it has a very small markup and a very small amount of profit per unit sold. Whereas if it has inelastic demand, then it has a much larger markup and larger profit per unit sold. And so one of the obvious questions then is, well, what determines the elasticity of a firm's demand curve? And one of the major things is whether or not there are a lot of substitutes available. So, if I'm selling apple juice, then there may be 12 other brands of apple juice that are almost identical to mine. And if I try to increase my price, then people are just going to switch into those other brands. Whereas if I have a good that is unique or at least close to unique, then I'm going to have a much more inelastic demand because there are very few substitutes. And so a lot of times a firm will spend a fair amount of time trying to um, make their product appear or be more unique so that it has fewer substitutes, so that it has a more inelastic demand, so that it can have a higher markup. Um, One way to do that is to reduce the amount of competition, right? And so one of the things we saw in the late 19th century was firms that would, buy up all their competition or drive their competition out of business so that they could then increase their markups and increase their profits. And so in the United States, we, passed things like the Sherman Antitrust Act. We created the Federal Trade Commission and other organizations to increase competition, right? And so to reduce the power of what were back then called trusts and what we now call monopolies. And competition policy is one of the more important policies that a government can undertake because the benefits of capitalism really come through competition, right? It's competition to try to get consumers to buy your product, and that takes the form of either coming up with new products or creating old products more cheaply. And so you want to make sure there's enough competition, and businesses often will devote a fair amount of resources to reducing the competition in their industry. Um, so obviously on the extreme is a monopoly. And so a monopoly basically is a firm that is the only firm in its market. And so it faces little to no competition, therefore has very inelastic demand, and can price significantly above marginal cost, which results in monopoly rents. And this is definitely a form of market failure because it results in a large deadweight loss, right? Now that said, there's the extreme of monopoly where there's only one firm. In the past you can think of companies like Standard Oil, AT&T, Microsoft, definitely behaved as a monopoly with its Windows and Office in the past, although it's been facing more competition recently. And so you want to, as a government, try to eliminate those monopolies and encourage competition. There are some cases where there will be a natural monopoly, and basically a natural monopoly arises when fixed costs are so high and marginal costs are so low that the average cost is always falling. And if that's the case, then it's cheaper for one firm to produce than two. So utilities, power distribution, water distribution are good examples of natural monopolies. It's possible that some of the network effects that we talked about earlier also result in natural monopolies. If there are 10 Facebooks, then they might be much less useful than having one Facebook. And so if that's the case, then you might want to regulate Facebook or firms like it. So instead of encouraging competition with those natural monopolies, you either have to, put in price controls or just make them publicly owned. And that's part of, sort of regulating a modern industrialized economy. So one of the things that firms do, as we just said, is to try to gain market power. And one way they can do that is by innovating, right? They can come up with new products, new processes. Sometimes they will want to patent them or copyright them. And so a patent allows, a new product or process to be protected from competition. And the reason that governments do that is to provide an incentive for firms to innovate. Sometimes firms will decide not to patent an innovation because they're worried that their competitors will find ways around the patent once they have that information. Another way to do it is through advertising, right? And so advertising can allow you to differentiate your product even when it's not really differentiated. So, things like Coke and Pepsi are good examples, or all the various light beers in the world. They're trying to generate brand loyalty to a product that isn't really differentiated in actual fact, so that they can have a less elastic demand than they would otherwise have. Both of these tactics can shift the firm's demand curve, or can just make it more inelastic and allow them to charge a higher markup. Um, One is obviously perhaps more beneficial to the economy, the path of innovation, than the path of advertising. So if we just summarize chapter 7 here, this is a model of a firm that has some market power. So in all of our examples, the firms face a downward sloping demand curve, which is realistic for most firms, not all firms certainly. And we'll talk about firms that don't have market power in the next chapter, in chapter 8. But when they do have some market power, then they can maximize profit by setting the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, or in terms of an iso profit curve, setting the tangent of the iso profit curve equal to the demand curve, or the marginal rate of substitution equal to the marginal rate of transformation. And then we talked about surplus and how the total surplus is producer surplus, which is price minus marginal cost, and the consumer surplus, which is willingness to pay minus price. And in situations in which firms have some market power, it's not a Pareto efficient solution, because firms are not producing at that place where the marginal cost meets the demand curve. We said firms' profits are going to depend on price elasticity of demand, and profits will be higher with more inelastic demand, where the price elasticity is lower, less than 1, and markup and profit will be lower when the price elasticity of demand is higher or greater than 1.